Most people think they know where stories like Chucky come from. A creepy doll, a killer spirit, Hollywood imagination. But there's one detail buried deep inside several real police reports from the late 1970s that was never supposed to become public. In more than one case, detectives documented children insisting that a doll had told them to do things before violent incidents happened inside their homes. Not possessed dolls. Not paranormal cases. Real homes, real families, real investigations. And the strangest part wasn't the dolls themselves. It was how similar the statements were, even though the families lived hundreds of miles apart and had never heard of each other. One of those reports was sealed for years after a psychiatrist attached to the investigation claimed the child involved was experiencing transferred personality fixation. But another investigator wrote something far more unsettling in the margin of his notes. He wrote, "The child appears more afraid of disappointing the doll than of disappointing adults." That line stayed buried for decades. And once you start looking into the real stories that may have inspired some of the most famous horror movies ever made, you realize something uncomfortable. If was senti really about those coming to life. It was about what people are capable of projecting onto them, and what happens when loneliness, trauma, and obsession start blurring together inside a child's mind. Back in the early 80s, long before internet rumors and creepy, police departments across parts of the United States quietly handled a small number of cases involving children becoming deeply attached to dolls in ways their parents described as disturbing. Most were written off as behavioral issues, but a few of them left behind details investigators couldn't fully explain. One case came out of upstate New York in 1978. A single mother named Carol lived with her 8-year-old son, Matthew, in a small duplex near Rochester. According to neighbors, Matthew barely spoke to other children. He spent most of his time indoors, usually carrying around a large red-haired doll his aunt had bought him from a second-hand shop. Tadalwasan, tea expensive. It wasn't rare. But according to multiple people interviewed later, Matthew treated it less like a toy and more like another person living in the house. At first, it seemed harmless. Carol told friends her son had finally found someone to talk to. After his father left, Matthew had become withdrawn and anxious. Teachers described him as intelligent, but emotionally distant. Then strange things started happening around the home. Food left out overnight would end up arranged in unusual patterns across the kitchen table. Cabinets opened on their own. Small objects disappeared and later showed up in strange places. Typical things people usually dismiss. But then Carol started hearing Matthew talking in his room late at night. Not unusual for a child, except neighbors later said there were often pauses in the conversation, like he was listening to someone respond. One night, Carol stood outside his bedroom door and listened for nearly 5 minutes. She later told investigators she heard her son whispering things like, "I don't want to," followed by long silence. Then, "No, she'll get mad." When she opened the door, Matthew was sitting cross-legged on the floor facing the doll. The doll was propped upright against the wall, and according to Carol, her son looked genuinely terrified when she interrupted them. If you enjoy real-life horror deep dives like this, make sure you're subscribed, because some of the cases we're covering this year only became public through archived police records and interviews most people have never seen before. At first, Carol assumed her son was coping with stress in an unhealthy way. The school counselor agreed. They recommended therapy. But before appointments could even begin, something happened that changed how the entire neighborhood viewed the family. A woman living next door called police after hearing screaming coming from Carol's house around 2 in the morning. Officers arrived to find Matthew sitting on the front porch barefoot in freezing temperatures, holding the doll tightly against his chest. Carol was inside with a deep cut along her arm from broken kitchen glass. She claimed her son had completely snapped after she threatened to throw the doll away. But what disturbed officers wasn't the injury. It was Matthew's reaction afterward. According to the responding deputy, the child showed almost no emotional response while his mother was bleeding nearby. Instead, he repeatedly asked officers not to separate him from the doll. He reportedly became hysterical whenever anyone touched it. Psychiatrists later concluded Matthew was likely suffering from severe attachment disorder combined with emotional trauma after his father abandoned the family. Rational explanation. Understandable explanation. But years later, one retired investigator admitted something still bothered him. During questioning, Matthew referred to the doll by a full name nobody recognized. When asked where he heard the name, he said, "He told me before he came here." The investigator initially assumed it was imagination, until they discovered faded initials stitched beneath the doll's clothing matching the same name. The original owner was never identified. And cases like that weren't isolated. In 1984, a child psychologist in Illinois began privately documenting what she called identity transfer behavior among socially isolated children attached to human-like toys. Her unpublished notes described children assigning authority, morality, and emotional dependence onto dolls in ways that resembled real interpersonal relationships. One section of her notes stands out. She wrote that some children appeared to externalize aggressive thoughts through dolls because it allowed them to emotionally distance themselves from guilt. In other words, the doll wanted it became psychologically easier than admitting I wanted it. That idea becomes much darker when you look at what happened in Connecticut in 1987. A 10-year-old boy named Jeremy became the focus of a police investigation after several small acts of vandalism escalated into something far more serious. Windows smashed, pets harmed, threatening notes left inside mailboxes. Neighbors blamed local teenagers, but investigators noticed something odd about the handwriting in the notes. The sentences were childish, inconsistent, and filled with references to a friend who was supposedly angry at the neighborhood. Jeremy eventually admitted writing them, but he insisted the ideas came from a doll he kept hidden in his basement. Detectives later described the basement as deeply unsettling, though not because of anything supernatural. It was the environment itself. Jeremy had built an entire makeshift room for the doll beneath the stairs. Tiny furniture, plates with food placed beside it, handwritten conversations taped to the wall. One detective later admitted it felt less like a child playing and more like a child trying desperately to maintain a relationship. Psychologists concluded Jeremy suffered from severe emotional neglect. His parents worked constantly. He had few friends. The doll became a psychological outlet for anger he couldn't express safely. Again, rational explanation, but there's a reason these cases stayed in people's memories. Because sometimes the details didn't line up neatly. During interviews, Jeremy repeatedly claimed the doll became different at night. Not alive, just different. More demanding, more aggressive. He described feeling pressured to obey thoughts he knew were wrong. When asked what he meant by pressured, he said something investigators never forgot. "He made me feel like if I ignored him, I'd disappear too." That line sounds fictional, scripted, like something written for a movie, but it came from a real transcript. BT Spoyne investigators had already connected the Rochester case, Matthew's childhood obsession, and several other disturbing reports involving isolated people forming emotional attachments to dolls. The details were different, but the pattern never changed. And as the investigation continued into the late 80s and early 90s, one final case from outside Tampa, Florida would leave even experienced detectives questioning how far loneliness could push the human mind. And maybe that's what makes these stories so uncomfortable. Not because dolls are haunted, but because children sometimes pour so much loneliness, fear, and identity into objects that those objects start functioning like separate personalities inside their minds. The fear becomes real, even if the supernatural isn't. By the late 80s, movies featuring killer dolls exploded in popularity across America. Most audiences saw them as exaggerated fun, campy, horror, but some psychologists quietly worried those films were touching a nerve people already had. Fear of innocence becoming distorted. Fear of not fully understanding what's happening inside your own child's head. Fear that something sitting silently in the corner of a room could become the center of a child's emotional world. And then there's the case most people still argue about today. Not because it proves anything paranormal, but because nobody has ever fully explained it. In 1991, a retired couple living outside Tampa, Florida contacted local authorities after discovering hundreds of cassette recordings hidden inside the walls of a home they'd recently purchased. The recordings belonged to the previous owner, a man named Daniel Harper, who had died several months earlier. At first, investigators assumed the tapes were harmless journals. They weren't. Most contained long conversations between Daniel and what appeared to be a doll, not a puppet performance. Not jokes. Conversations. hours of them. Daniel spoke to the doll as if it were a child living in the house with him. Sometimes he comforted it. Sometimes he argued with it. Sometimes he apologized to it after emotional breakdowns. Neighbors later described Daniel as quiet but deeply isolated after his wife died. Some remembered seeing him carrying the doll through the house near windows late at night. But what truly disturbed investigators were the final recordings. Over the last few weeks before his death, Daniel began referring to himself less and less by his own name. He increasingly spoke as if he and the doll were becoming the same person. On one tape, he says, "You know things I don't remember anymore." On another, his voice becomes shaky as he whispers, "I think you're the part of me that stayed angry." No supernatural events were ever confirmed. No evidence of possession, just a profoundly lonely man mentally collapsing in isolation. But the final tape changed how some investigators viewed the entire case. The tape was recorded 2 nights before Daniel died. For almost 20 minutes, he can be heard speaking softly to the doll. Then suddenly, he stops. And according to audio experts who later reviewed the tape, there's a long silence before Daniel quietly says, "I didn't say that." People online have spent years arguing over what that means. Some believe he was schizophrenic. Others think grief and isolation destroyed his sense of reality. A few insist the pause contains faint audio that sounds almost like whispering, though experts never agreed on that. But the unsettling part isn't the tape itself. It's what police found afterward. When officers entered the home after Daniel's death, the doll was sitting at the kitchen table facing the hallway, and scattered across the table were handwritten pages repeating the same sentence over and over again. He listens when nobody else does. Send this to someone who grew up watching horror movies. Because once you start looking into the real psychological roots behind stories like these, the movies stop feeling completely fictional. What makes all of this even more disturbing is how consistent certain patterns are across unrelated cases. Isolation, emotional neglect, trauma, and objects becoming emotional substitutes for human connection. Psychologists now understand that children, and even adults, can project personality onto objects far more intensely than most people realize, especially during periods of stress or loneliness. It's part of something called anthropomorphism, where the brain assigns human traits to non-human things. Normally, it's harmless. People name cars, talk to pets, keep sentimental objects. But under extreme emotional conditions, the line between comfort and dependency can start dissolving. And when that happens, objects can become containers for thoughts people don't want to claim as their own: anger, fear, violence, guilt. That's why some investigators looking back on these old cases believe the real horror was never supernatural. It was psychological fragmentation, children and adults splitting parts of themselves into objects, because facing those emotions directly felt impossible. But there's still one detail that refuses to disappear. Several unrelated individuals across different cases describe the same feeling almost word for word. Not that the doll was alive, not that it moved, but that it was waiting. Waiting to be acknowledged. Waiting to be listened to. Waiting to become important again. And maybe that sounds ridiculous until you remember how human beings work. We naturally search for faces in darkness, meaning in silence. Companionship in objects, especially when we're alone long enough. Maybe that's why stories about dolls continue to terrify people more than monsters ever could. Because deep down, everyone understands the feeling of projecting emotions onto something that can't actually love them back. Toward the end of one archived interview from the Rochester case, investigators asked Matthew, now an adult, if he still believed the doll ever talked to him. There's a long pause in the recording before he answers, and what he says is probably the most unsettling part of this entire story. He says, "No, I think I was just lonely enough to need it too." Then he laughs, nervously, and adds one final sentence. "But sometimes, I still sleep facing the bedroom door." No one asked him why. The interview ended there. And maybe that's the reason stories like these never fully disappear. Not because people believe dolls are secretly alive, but because these cases force us to confront something much more real. The terrifying things isolation can do to the human mind. The way fear reshapes memory. The way loneliness can create relationships where none exists. Or worse, the possibility that some people know exactly what's happening to them and still can't stop. So now I want to know what you think. Do Do you believe these cases were nothing more than trauma and psychological projection? Or do you think there's something else hidden underneath these stories that investigators never fully understood? And if you had a doll sitting alone in a dark room for years, would you eventually start feeling like it was waiting for you to come back to?